Alrighty, hi you guys. The purpose of this video is to go over our global and social stratification lectures. So first and foremost, getting into the learning objectives for our social stratification lecture. Sorry about that. Our first objective would be to define social stratification. Secondly, we are going to set out to explain the basic class structure of American society. Thirdly, we're going to discuss other forms of social stratification found in societies throughout the world. Fourth, we are going to identify the different types of social mobility. And fifth, we are going to explain the theoretical perspectives on social stratification. So, beginning out, what is social stratification? Basically, social stratification is the way that societies are organically ordered that result in some people or some groups of people, some aggregates of people enjoying more privilege than others. Some members of the society, that is, having certain social advantages, visible social advantages over others. So that is what social stratification is. Now, all forms of societies, or all recognized societies, all technical societies have a form of social stratification. Therefore, this means that all forms or all societies throughout the world, found throughout the world, have a form of inequality that can be observed throughout them. Because once again, if there is a social system that produces a such thing as privilege, then we know that the opposite of privilege would be inequality. All right, so therefore, all societies have a form of social inequality. So, social stratification in the United States is based on a lot of different variables, or that is, it is multi-causal, and we will revisit that theme in later lecture, or in our lecture over global stratification. But basically, multi-causal means that anything that we can say is caused by many different things. Some of the different things that cause or that determine one's social position in the social stratification of American society, or that style of social stratification, would be race, occupation, class, etc., etc. Now, if we use an intersectional approach, then we can observe all of these variables and come to a conclusion, or at least a hypothesis, of how that variable actually interacts with the inequality that results from interactions on a day-to-day basis. All right. So formally, the American social class structure. I'm sorry. Formerly, the American social class structure is stratified by class. Social class would refer to any system of people, or any aggregate of people, any population of people who occupy the same or similar levels of privilege, or same level or same social positions, same statuses in society. You have three main classes in the United States that is currently observed. That would be upper, lower, and middle class. Again, some of these other different factors that are supposed to determine, or that we see determines an individual or a group's social class, would be things like wealth, right? Wealth and income, two of the main factors. The difference here, though, is the important thing. Okay, so wealth would be the net value of everything that you have, that you own, that is worth any money, while your income would be wages that you receive for some type of labor that you did on a on a normal basis, right, or semi-normal basis. All right, and then the form of social stratification that America saw prior to basically the emancipation of enslaved people was slavery, right? And this is a system of stratification where the lowest, I guess you could say, class of people would be slaves. But there are two different types of stratification systemically, right? Or that is two different types of results that they kind of produce. One would be an open system, and then another would be a closed system. So an open system would be a system such as meritocracy. A meritocracy is a system to where people receive privileges based on things that are valued by society, and also talents. Those talents though have to be valued by society in theory, according to theories that we'll get to a little bit later on. But a closed system does not necessarily have a meritocracy. Closed systems have very little to no change in their social structure, or that is the mobility or the ability to move up or down the strata of those systems. And then stratified marriage. All right, stratified marriage basically is how marriage is basically stratified, or systems of marriage are stratified. And then also too, it also reflects how people within certain systems or certain social systems actually intermingle. In this case, in the case of dating and marriage and stuff like that, or mate selection. So endogamy would be the marriage of people from the same social class or the same social background. And then exogamy would be intermarriage, right? Marriage between people of different social backgrounds. Status consistency. Status consistency. We see status consistency in pretty much all societies, but even in societies that are supposedly freer, right? We see still what we call status consistency, and that's basically the people who basically run a social system. They all have the same social status, have the same social variables, right? White, male, right? Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, etc., etc. All right, so speaking of social mobility is the ability to move up or down the strata of a social system. So if you look at stratification like a ladder, right? You see a ladder has different rungs on it. The higher up on the rungs you go, the higher up you'll be on the ladder, essentially. So basically that's all stratification is, and each rung would be a strata, or basically a classification of people. Basically reflects where they are, high and low. So basically, social mobility looks at how an individual is able to, how much or how little an individual is able to move up or down, perhaps the social ladder, if we say, if we can use that cliche term, if you will, to make things a little bit clearer for you. So basically, social mobility is basically the ability for people to move up or down the rungs of society, right, or the stratification of society. So upward mobility would obviously be one's ability to move up. So an example of that would be after you graduate from college and you receive your credentials, you get another job. So let's say you are like a short order cook, or something like that, right? And then you get a job, and you leave that and get another job after you get your credentials based on the credentials that you got. Let's say like as an undergrad, right? So like you go from being a short order cook to an engineer, right? So that would be considered upward social mobility, because you move, or you gain in class in that type of situation. Then you have downward social mobility, would basically be if you go from being an engineer to back to being a short order cook, right? In that unfortunate situation, that would be downward social mobility. And then lateral mobility would just be making moves. Let's say you go from one engineering firm to another engineering firm. It doesn't necessarily, like, maybe you get like $5,000 more a year per se, right? That $5,000 more a year doesn't necessarily put you in another social class, right? Meaning that your neighborhood is perhaps not going to be any different. The status of the people, the jobs of the people around that you live around, stuff like that, it's not going to necessarily be different. Again, it was for perhaps you took the job because not only was it more money, but also it was closer to home. So it's a better move for you as a person individually, but it doesn't necessarily change your social class. So that would be an example of lateral mobility, the moving across income and class without ascending or descending social class. All right, let's speak on poverty. Poverty is the lowest living standards of any strata of society. You have two different types of poverty. You have relative poverty and absolute poverty. Relative poverty actually is poverty that would be considered poverty, like an impoverished living condition based on the living standards of a particular society. All right, so that is to say that, you know, the standard of poverty here is not necessarily the standard of poverty in India. So speaking to the standard of poverty in India, right, that would probably perhaps be more likened to absolute poverty, and that would be poverty that would be considered impoverished conditions anywhere you go. All right. So again, a person that is living below the poverty line here could actually, you know, go to another country and not necessarily be considered living below the poverty line, and that is because of the economic standard of that particular country in question. All right. When it comes to poverty, we also see that there is gender. There are gender. There is gender. There are gender controls for that as well, right? Or there are variables of gender that actually we can control for and see some pretty alarming things. So basically, what we are going to point out in this lecture is the feminization of poverty. So that is the tendency of impoverished conditions to uh, be experienced, more likely to be experienced by women, right, or people who have an effeminized position in society, essentially women, right? So there are a lot of different social factors that cause the feminization of poverty, such as like single parenthood. Again, both teenage pregnancy and single parenthood being two social problems that women experience. By and large, mostly over men. And then, living in a patriarchal society. A patriarchy is a male dominated society, so social norms are not inclusive to women or even centered around women at all in a patriarchal society, and they're just basically all of the social norms are fit to meet the male needs of or the male desires of society, I guess you could say. So poverty is functional on a social level, being a. I'm sorry. We're going to go into some theories about poverty, right? So different perspectives in sociology say different things about poverty and social stratification. So we are first going to look at the functionalists. Classic functionalists, will be the first to say that poverty is functional on a societal level because it sets standards for everyday citizens on what not to be, how not to live. It drives and then it also, through that, serves as a sense of motivation for the everyday citizen because they're going to be motivated not to actually live like the person who is living in poverty lives. And then also, belonging to the functionalist theory, we have the Davis-Moore thesis, and this says that the purpose of social stratification within itself is to compensate for people who are, or not compensate for, but compensate people who basically lead society, people who have all of the talents in society, basically. The Davis-Moore thesis states that the greater the talent, presumably the greater the compensation. So basically, the society has to value the talent in order for the talent to be, highly compensated. So this would explain one of the reasons why, you know, doctors, I guess you could say loosely, doctors are paid so much in our society because this is a talent. To heal the human body is a talent that is supposedly highly regarded in American society. All right, so yeah, that's the Davis-Moore thesis that also belongs to the functionalist theory. Um, the standard of the compensation, according to this thesis, is based on the needs of society. If the society has a low value for the talent, then the talent is going to be compensated low, kind of just like what I was saying before. And then you also have the conflict theory on social stratification. Now, they look to intersectionality to actually explain the differences of experience based on people's social class. But first, before we get into that, conflict And poverty and inequality are natural consequences of the struggle over resources, first of all. But in the capitalist economic structure, it produces a widespread or a unnecessary level of inequality and conflict throughout society. Resources are controlled heavily by the dominant group, and they therefore distribute these resources unequally. Um, Now, this kind of cycle of greed or unequal distribution causes alienation. All right, alienation actually occurs when the proletariat class, or the people who are actually producing the labor in society, they're separated from the labor that they produce. So, for an example, the person that actually produces the table, we don't think of the person that produces the table. We just basically think of the function of the table and what we use it for, and that's the only value that we have for it. And the conditions for that individual, we don't think about that, right? We don't think that this person produces thousands of these tables that look the same way, this on the same on the same level, and so on and so forth. But we also don't think of the fact that before capitalism, or before an industrialized society, right? People could put their own they could put their own creative spin on producing tables. Okay, so again, uh, not being able to do that actually helps out in the process of alienation, according to the conflict theory. So the conflict theory looks at alienation and the process of alienation through labor, or the exploitation of labor, as a sole focus for explaining stratification and how societies in modern day times, or post-industrial times, or industrial times, are stratified. Um, that being said, it's a little bit different from the take of alienation according to the functionalists. Okay, so when they talk about alienation, they're mostly talking about why people experience social inequality when they're trying to become socialized and stuff like that, right? But that's totally different, and that concept of alienation is explained or by the functionalists as on the terms of the people who experience the alienation basically not having um, different behaviors that are valued by society, and therefore they experience alienation. But that's something totally different from alienation when it comes to social stratification, according to the conflict theory. All right, and then last but not least, we have the symbolic interactionist theory. They say the system of stratification exists as it does without much change due to rationalization of society. Going back to the rationalization of society in earlier lecture, this is a concept of Weber. And Max Weber says that people, or the bureaucratic organization, is becoming so influential in society, having so much power in society, that people themselves are beginning to act like little bureaucracies. And we rationalize everything. Every little thing that we do has to be rationalized and broken down. Division of labor is of primary importance in the ideal type of bureaucracy, and therefore it is the ideal importance throughout society, to individuals and to social institutions. Individuals usually only come in contact with people of their same social class as a result, and this is normalized. Similarities or status consistency amongst classes usually means a lack of exposure to people of higher class standing. As a result, individuals are only exposed to the socially normative behaviors associated with their own class, and they reproduce behaviors, and these behaviors are also reproduced to their children, and so on and so forth. Rarely, higher class solidifies their class standing. they rarely I'm sorry, these people rarely come in contact with people of a higher class standing. All right, so that pretty much solidifies their class standing, or the behaviors that are associated with their class standing. So that's the end of our social stratification lecture. Alrighty, and it looks like I have enough time to perhaps go into our our global stratification lecture. All right, so basically, if social stratification is the organization of groups within a society, then global stratification would be how countries are stratified, or categorized in society based on a system of hierarchy. So learning objectives for this particular lecture is to articulate the effects of globalization on countries, categorize countries based on global stratification, differentiate between Cold World and world system classifications of nations, comprehend the dimensions of industrialization and deindustrialization and their effect on the stratification of societies, and number 5, lastly, apply theoretical concepts of global stratification. So we already know what global stratification is, the hierarchy applying to countries. However, it is kind of determined by, or the focal concept behind global stratification will be globalization. All right, a lot of you all have probably heard of this term, but to simplify it, it really just only speaks to the amount of power and influence that countries begin to have over smaller or less dominant countries. All right, so the process of dominant countries influencing less dominant countries. Now, this happens on 3 different levels. It happens on the economic level, political, and cultural level. So, an example of this economic influence would be, for instance, here in America, we have a lot of economic influence over Mexico, to the effect of, if we go on vacation to Mexico, in a lot of places, not all places in Mexico, but in a lot of places, especially places that have tourism, all right, then we would be able to spend our American currency in that country. And then political globalization, kind of the same idea. Well, it is the same idea, just on a political scale. A political system of a stronger nation influencing a less stronger or a less strong, political system of a nation. And then the cultural, all right, this is the process of cultural aspects of a country, a more stronger country, having influence over another one. That would, in the case of that, an example of that would be McDonald's. McDonald's is now on every continent where there are people now, but it was something that originated here in California, actually. So the causes of globalization also are multi-causal. Again, multi-causal meaning having more than one or more than two sources. I'm sorry. The evolution of technology is the main catalyst for globalization, right? And the people who actually, not the people, but the countries that actually were leading the world in technological advancements, right? They are now leading the world, financially and stuff like that as well. The motive of globalization also depends on your theoretical perspective. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So some people would say, for an example, the motive of the way that countries are stratified is to end world poverty. And then you have a super territorialism perspective, and this is the ideology of the necessity of the dominant forces of the world. They need to maintain that dominance because they actually lead the world from going into dark times and so on and so forth, right? So the effects of globalization, global stratification, or the effects of globalization results in the hierarchy of nations. That is to articulate differently dependent on the view of the historical period. Cold War terminology, basically the Cold War was the time following the Vietnam War where, the United States and Russia were in conflict with one another, and every country that backed those superpowers were also in conflict with one another, depending on which side they fell on, and so on and so forth. But we have a certain terminology that kind of came from that period of time, to where that actually reflects how actually most of people in America view what we would call in sociology global stratification. So the first one would be, or the first category in that would be first world. Again, most of us know what a first world nation would be. This is the world's richest nations. Second world, again, these are people of moderate wealth and power. Third world would be the world's poorest nations. And then also too, you have fourth world. Now, a lot of you all may not have heard of this term, but fourth world basically refers to people who are stigmatized within a country throughout societies, right? So it could be the indigenous people of societies. It could the indigenous populations, right? The Afro populations, or the the populations that are basically black or people who have lineage from Africa. Um, Fourth world, again, if you have countries where that highly stigmatized gay and lesbian people, right, that they would be considered fourth world, right? So it's not necessarily a country of people, but the level of stigmatization that they actually experience. Sorry about that. All right. So world systems terminology is different. So the world systems analysis basically is the analysis of globalization. Looks at how globalization happens on three different platforms, as we discussed before: economic, cultural, and economic, cultural, and political. All right. So it looks at the flow of those different influences. And according to this analysis, it always goes from out inward, right? So it goes from core nations or the most powerful nations outward, right? Sorry, not inward, outward. Okay, so if you were to look at a diagram, right, draw a diagram with some circles on it, and you have a core, right, in the middle of all those circles, then the flow of influence always goes out from the core nations. So the core nations would be the strongest nations, with the most amount of influences over all nations. So, for instance, once again, McDonald's being on every country, being on every continent where there's people, right? That would be an example of the influence. In this case, it would be cultural influence going outward. Semi-peripheral nations, those nations that are characterized by moderately powerful militaries, if any military at all, strong economies, and a moderate level of influence over peripheral nations. And then you also have peripheral nations. These are the nations that are the weakest of all. If they have any military, the military is weak, small. They have characteristic of having coups that operate within those territories. Poor economies, ultimately dependent on semi-peripheral and core nations for stability. All right, so some examples of core nations. Well, there are only 4 real core nations in the world right now. That would be Russia, China, and the United States, and Great Britain. Then semi-peripheral nations, there are several of those, but for example, a semi-peripheral nation would be a nation like Brazil, Mexico, India, Israel, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, even those countries such as Germany, which I feel like they just have received clearance or approval to have their own military, right? But because of World War II, they didn't have a military, but that didn't make them a peripheral nation, which would be an example of like Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti, Sudan, places like that. Modernization theory. So the modernization theory is a functionalist theory of why the stratification of countries looks the way it does. It says basically poor peripheral nations benefit from core nations, especially with decreasing of poverty, right? So the number one function of the modernization theory is to decrease poverty, and this decreasing of poverty happens in 4 different stages. You have the traditional stage, the takeoff stage, the drive to technological maturity, and then the last one, the high mass consumption stage. But with this traditional stage, the country does not break out of tradition, and because of this, it isolates itself a lot of times, characteristic of being culturally isolated. They depend on mechanical solidarity because they don't necessarily have industry that actually dictates that they actually depend on organic solidarity. They depend on a lot of superstition or just a lot of traditional ways of doing things a lot of times, just because that's the way that it's always been done. All right, so these countries are in particular extremely poor. Then you also have the takeoff stage. So this is the second stage. So let's say that extremely poor country starts to produce products that are a little bit innovative. Then through this, people start shopping there more. Then they actually increase their actual trade more. Then they have a wider array of goods and services on their markets. Then the drive to technological maturity would be the third stage. So let's say that this growth continues to happen with the markets. This drive to technological maturity is when they have like an industry. So first of all, you have markets, little bitty markets actually compose big industries. All right, so now they're growing to develop their industrial and technological phase of their country. So this stage consists of citizens being more open to change and new technology, industrialized economies. Again, this is when you start to see industry come into the country. Family traditions and values are devalued. Poverty begins to decrease significantly in this third stage as well, which is the overall purpose of modernization theory, right? Is to decrease world poverty. And then high mass consumption is the last stage. So this is basically when the stage is fully industrialized and they have a pretty decent economy that can, operate on its own or, somewhat independently. This stage consists of fully developed economy, citizens consuming of a wide range of goods and services, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So the role of core nations, right, according to modernization theory, is to control the population, right, to make sure that through education and birth control and things like that, countries or the world doesn't overpopulate. Increase food production, to introduce industrial technology and provide foreign aid. Now you also have another theory called the dependency theory. Now the modernization theory, again, is a functionalist theory. The dependency theory is a conflict theory, and its perspective is different. It says, wait, yeah, there is a lot of dependency on core nations. However, these groups or these countries that depend on these core nations, they don't actually benefit from this dependence, and in fact, they actually experience more poverty. All right, so according to the dependency theory, poor nations are forced into a state of dependence upon core nations through an intricate process. Now, this process consists of three different phases. The first one is narrow export-oriented economies. That is, the poor nations don't have a lot of things to export. They don't produce a lot of goods and services to sell to other countries. So the core nation then takes advantage of that by buying whatever little things, let's say like bananas, right? They'll buy those for a very, very undercut price, right? Very, very cheap price. And then a lack of industrial capacity is the second phase, right? So the poor nations don't have any way to produce technology or produce goods and services themselves because they don't have a big industry, or they don't have industry at all, or production of goods and services at all that happens, right? So as a result of a lack of export, poor nations lack the economic power to build industry, which drives economic growth, right? So therefore, the poor nations borrow money, or they buy goods and services from, therefore, they buy goods and services that they can't produce themselves from other countries, right? From core nations for an exorbitant amount, right? So for an expensive price, okay? So selling your goods and services for a cheap, under market price, and then turning around and buying things for a very, very expensive price leads you to a state of being poor, right? So foreign debt is the last phase, and foreign debt is the unequal trading patterns that we just aforementioned for purchasing goods and services actually forces the poor nations to actually borrow money from the core nations. And through this money, it's just kind of like, with your bill collectors or whatever, you kind of feel like they own you sometimes, right? Well, it's just the same way with countries, right? So colonialism doesn't necessarily exist like that anymore, right, in the world, right? But this is the new colonialism, neo-colonialism, owning another country through debt that is produced by unequal trading patterns. Now, that is the dependency theory, and that is how the dependency theory explains the flow of influence from core nations to peripheral, semi-peripheral, and peripheral nations. All right, so hopefully this helps out you guys a little bit. Hopefully it's easy to follow. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and let me know. All right, thanks for hanging in there. Peace.